how did an unknown 18-year-old English girl, disowned by her family and living in a scandalous relationship with a penniless poet, come to write one of the greatest and most influential masterpieces of English literature? Frankenstein, a name that immediately conjures up images of death, brutish monsters, and mad scientists in dark Gothic laboratories, illuminated only by random flashes of lightning.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Some of the most iconic words ever heard in a horror film. But how exactly did Frankenstein come into life? I'm Graeme Yorston. Welcome to my channel. Today we're exploring the extraordinary life of Mary Shelley. It was a life dominated by death, her mother, her sister, her husband, her children, and a dream of defeating death, a dream that led the fertile mind of a young woman to create a story that still fascinates us 200 years later. Mary Shelley was born in Enlightenment London in 1797, a time when a mad king was on the throne, French royalty had gone to the guillotine, and America was redefining democracy. Her father was William Godwin, a radical political philosopher and staunch critic of institutions that perpetuated authority and coercion. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, one of the earliest and most influential works of feminist philosophy. But just 11 days after the birth, Mary Wollstonecraft passed away from puerperal fever. Although the risk of dying during childbirth came down during the 18th century to around 2 to 3%, the increasing medicalisation of the process actually increased the rate of childbed fever or puerperal sepsis, as there was no knowledge of how to prevent the spread of infection. Doctors and midwives didn't wash their hands or instruments between cases, and were initially resistant to the idea that this might be a good thing to do. So William Godwin was left to bring up Mary and her elder half-sister Fanny from Wollstonecraft's affair with American writer and diplomat Gilbert Imlay by himself. Despite advocating for the abolition of marriage in his writings, 4 years later Godwin got married again to Mary Jane Clairmont, a neighbour and supposed widow with 2 children, although in fact she had never been married. And just 6 months after their union she gave birth to a boy, who died in infancy, little Mary's first experience of death. But the new Mrs. Godwin had another son shortly afterwards, adding a 5th child to the household. It was not an easy childhood for Mary, as her stepmother was described as easy to anger and argumentative, and more bluntly as a vulgar and worldly woman rather inclined to boast of her total ignorance of philosophy, which made her an unpopular figure in Godwin's intellectually elevated circle, and the questionable legitimacy of some of the children resulted in the family being shunned by the more conservative elements of society. An intelligent and imaginative child, Mary was given a comprehensive, if eclectic, education. She had access to her father's extensive library, and Godwin took his children on educational trips, encouraged their learning and interests, and arranged meetings with the many artists and intellectuals who visited him, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, and United States founding father Aaron Burr. At a time when most girls were taught only the basics of the 3 R's of reading, writing and arithmetic, and the practical skills to prepare them for becoming a wife, Mary was studying literature, philosophy and ancient history. Her father's kindness, however, could not make up for the loss of her mother, and Mary remained very attached to her memory despite never knowing her. I'm at the St Pancras Old Churchyard, where her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was originally buried. Mary used to spend time here reading and it's said that she learnt to read by tracing out the letters on her mother's tombstone. It's also said that she consummated her love for Percy Shelley here, close to her mother's tomb. The closeness she felt towards her mother was not how she felt about her stepmother. Their relationship was strained, with the second Mrs. Godwin being jealous of the bond between father and daughter, and openly favouring her own children. This led to Mary seeking comfort and companionship in books, and as a child she loved nothing more than writing stories. She may even have published her first poem, Mounseer Nongtongpo, at the age of 10, which was included in her father's juvenile library series. Alongside their publishing company, the Godwins also ran a bookshop, selling stationery, children's books and puzzles. But the business never made enough to earn a decent living, and her father only narrowly managed to avoid debtor's jail. The tensions in the household probably contributed to Mary developing headaches and a painful skin condition that was so severe at one point her entire arm was covered in cracked eczematous sores, and she was unable to use it. Her biographer Fiona Simpson suggests that this may have led to the creation of Frankenstein, as her limb must have felt like a monstrous appendage stitched from some other body to her own. I don't know about you, but that sounds a little too fanciful for me. And there is a theory that it wasn't eczema at all, but herpes zoster or chickenpox, and that this was responsible for some of her symptoms in later life as well. Godwin was not unaware of the lack of affection between his wife and daughter. So in 1812, just before her 15th birthday, he sent Mary to live with his friend William Baxter and his family in Scotland. Baxter was a businessman and fellow radical, who believed in education for the masses and helped found the Dundee Public Library. We don't know the full reasoning behind her being sent to Scotland, but we do know she flourished away from London and her skin problems healed up completely. One of the recurring themes in the works of Mary Shelley is isolation. And it seems likely that her own sense of isolation began in her lonely childhood, left behind by her real mother and unloved by her mother's stand-in. While in Scotland, though, she became close friends with Baxter's daughters, Isabel and Christina, and was given full freedom to explore the city with all its sights, both earthy and enlightened. At the time, Dundee was one of Britain's main whaling ports, and the Baxter family house was located in full view of the carcasses being brought ashore, cut up and melted down for oil. She returned to Dundee the following year and later acknowledged the importance of her time in the city in helping to piece together her ideas to create Frankenstein, writing that,
"The airy flights of my imagination were born and fostered in Dundee."
The house where she stayed is long gone, but the rather forbidding Gothic steps near it have been named the Frankenstein Steps. Healthier, more confident, 2 years older, and back in London, Mary had an encounter that would change her life forever. The exact date of Mary's first meeting with Percy Bysshe Shelley is not known, but it was probably as she was approaching her 17th birthday on one of Percy's regular visits to meet her father. Shelley had been writing since his school days at Eton College, and had published his first work, the Gothic novel Zastrozzi, at the age of 18 in 1810. Followed by a collection of poetry and a verse melodrama, and he'd always been politically inclined. From a wealthy family, Shelley had enjoyed a comfortable and privileged upbringing, but he rejected his family's bourgeois lifestyle after reading Godwin's Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, and decided that his family's wealth should be donated to those in need, which led to him being estranged from his father, who expected him to live a more traditional, aristocratic lifestyle. Shelley met Godwin with the hope of the older man becoming his political advisor and mentor, a role he readily accepted, coming as it did with the expectation of financial benefits. However, after months of Shelley failing to come up with any cash, their relationship became strained, not helped by the young poet's growing interest in Mary. Godwin might have been more positive about this if it had not been for one serious problem. Percy Shelley was already married. Shelley had met his first wife, 16-year-old Harriet Westbrook, a school friend of his sister's, in 1810 when he was at Oxford, from where he was promptly expelled after distributing his pamphlet The Necessity of Atheism. He convinced Harriet that she was being oppressed by both her father and her education, and persuaded her to elope with him to Edinburgh, where they married. Both were immediately cut off by their families, but Harriet eventually relented and reinstated her allowance, which Shelley used to fund his lifestyle. Harriet was involved in Percy's work, and even helped distribute his political essays in Dublin, and they had a daughter, Ianthe, in 1813. But the strain of constantly living beyond their means, having to evade creditors, and Shelley's roving eye meant that they had grown apart by 1814, although not before Harriet had fallen pregnant again, which is precisely when he began courting Mary. They went for long walks discussing literature, philosophy and politics. Shelley was intoxicated by her mind, feeling he had found his intellectual equal at last. But it wasn't just her mind he was interested in, and in her mother's graveyard they declared their feelings for one another and consummated their love. Mary simply couldn't understand why her father disapproved, and when he forbade them from seeing each other, they decided to elope to France. Still only 16, Mary, accompanied by her stepsister, set off with a 21-year-old Shelley for the continent. Hurt and angry that she had disobeyed him, her father disowned her. Europe had been ravaged by the relentless criss-crossing of vengeful armies in the Napoleonic Wars. But that didn't matter to Mary, who, overflowing with excitement and joy, wrote that it felt like they were
acting in a novel, an incarnate romance.
But even the sweetest romance needs cash to keep it going. And having reached Switzerland by donkey, mule, carriage and foot, and finding themselves penniless, they were forced to turn back for home. Their return journey down the Rhine took them to the town of Gernsheim, 10 miles from a ruined hilltop castle, associated with the legend of an 18th century alchemist, Johann Dippel, who created an elixir of life. But he is also said to have dug up the bodies of the dead for his experiments, and to have created a monster. The name of the castle? Frankenstein. Back in England, there was no improvement in their precarious financial situation. Mary's father refused to see her. Percy was constantly disappearing to evade his creditors. And to make matters worse, Mary found herself pregnant. She was often ill, and Percy was showing rather too much interest in her stepsister Claire, who was still living with them. And when Shelley's wife, Harriet, gave birth to a son, he began spending time with her again, and encouraged Mary to take his friend Thomas Hogg as a lover. Even for someone who theoretically advocated free love, it was all very confusing. Mary's first child, a daughter, was born 2 months early and died after only a few days. The loss of her child and fears about Shelley's fidelity led to a period of deep melancholy. She was haunted by visions of her infant and wrote in her journal,
I dream my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold and that we rubbed it by the fire and it lived. I awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day.
However, by the summer she was pregnant again, and in better spirits, improved further by the death of Percy's grandfather, which finally gave them some money to keep them afloat. They moved to a cottage near Windsor, where their son William was born in January 1816, and it was during this happier period that she first learned about galvanism, seeing scientific demonstrations showing how electric shocks could reanimate the flesh of dead animals. With their son just 3 months old, Mary, Percy and Claire set off for another European adventure. The plan was to meet up with Lord Byron in Geneva, with whom Claire, who was carrying his child, hoped to rekindle her romance. 1816 was known as the Year Without a Summer, as the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the year before dramatically affected the global climate. Mary wrote that
it was a wet, uncongenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house.
So instead of being able to explore Switzerland's rugged countryside, they had to find ways of entertaining themselves indoors. They discussed poetry, politics, science and philosophy, their deliberations fuelled by gargantuan quantities of alcohol and laudanum, an addictive elixir of opium and high-proof spirits. In June the weather got even worse, and they were stuck together for 3 days and nights at the Villa Diodati, with Byron and his personal physician John Polidori. They had been reading aloud from Phantasmagoriana, a French collection of German horror stories, and Byron proposed that they should each write a ghost story of their own. Shelley struggled with the task. When Byron was reciting Coleridge's poem Christabel, he suddenly shrieked and ran out of the room. Polidori recorded in his diary that he threw water in his face and gave him ether, and that when he was looking at Mrs. Shelley, he suddenly thought of a woman he had heard of who had eyes instead of nipples. Not unusual for Shelley, as he'd been prone to dramatic hallucinations since childhood. But he eventually recovered his composure and wrote a fragment of a ghost story based on some of his early life experiences. He soon abandoned this, however, and it is now lost. Byron also began, and quickly abandoned, a fragment of a story, just a few pages long, featuring a mysterious aristocratic character, Augustus Darvel, who dies in a Turkish cemetery near Ephesus. Byron knew about vampire legends from his previous travels, and his plan was for Darvel to be resurrected to reveal his true nature. But he lost interest in the story and moved on to writing his dramatic poem Manfred instead. Somewhat daunted by the company he was in, but wanting to impress, Dr. Polidori also struggled to think of anything to write. According to Mary, his first attempt was
some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady who was punished for peeping through a keyhole.
But he soon abandoned this and developed Byron's idea into his own tale, The Vampire, the first modern iteration of the sophisticated, seductive vampire that we know today. At first, Mary also struggled to think of a ghost story. But when their discussions turned to the nature of the vital essence of life, and Polidori, who had studied under Alexander Monroe, an authority on animal electricity, shared his knowledge of galvanism, she had the germ of her idea, reconstructing and reanimating a corpse, and thus Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was born. She dreamt of
the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, which then, on the working of some powerful engine, showed signs of life, and stirred with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be.
Percy and Mary returned to England partly in response to worrying letters from Mary's half-sister Fanny Imlay. After one particularly alarming letter, Percy went off to search for her, but it was too late. Fanny was found dead in a Swansea inn, with a farewell to the world note and a bottle of laudanum beside her. The death of her beloved sister weighed heavily on both Mary and Percy, as Mary believed that the reason for Fanny's torment was that she too was in love with Percy. And then, just 2 months later, Shelley's wife Harriet was found drowned in the Serpentine Lake in Hyde Park. She had been unable to bear the separation from Shelley and having to live back in her father's house. And she was pregnant again, possibly by Shelley, possibly by some dashing cavalry officer from the nearby barracks in Knightsbridge. Shelley was upset, a bit, writing that, beyond the mere shock of so hideous a catastrophe having fallen on a human being once so nearly connected with me, there would, in any case, have been little to regret. But there was then a no-holds-barred custody battle over the children. Shelley wanted to have them together with Mary, and to strengthen their case they wed just weeks after Harriet's death. Harriet's family, however, strongly opposed this, and a court decided that Shelley, because of his atheism, radicalism, and very public affair with Mary, was morally unfit to care for his children, and they were sent to live with the family of a clergyman. Throughout this period, undeterred by the travelling and family tragedies, Mary worked on her novel, and it was largely complete by the time her third child, another daughter, was born. Frankenstein was published in January 1818, anonymously. The book was dedicated to her father, with whom she was reconciled, and prefaced with Percy Shelley's explanation on the origins of the story, which led many to conclude that he was the author. Initial reactions were rather mixed. Sir Walter Scott, despite noting some problems with the plot, praised the author's original genius and happy power of expression. However, John Wilson Croker, writing in the Quarterly Review, described the book as a tissue of horrible and disgusting absurdity. When Mary was revealed as the true author, there was a predictable sexist backlash. The British critic attacked the novel, saying, "If our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, it is no reason why we should, and we shall therefore dismiss the novel without further comment." Despite the reviews, Frankenstein was an immediate success, becoming widely known through stage adaptations. But despite her book's success, the newly married couple's finances remained fragile, and Percy, still alienated from his family, had to dodge his creditors by disappearing for days at a time. All of which left them feeling exhausted, and eventually, genuinely fearing debtor's prison, they decided to move to Italy, taking Mary's stepsister Claire and her daughter by Byron with them. They travelled around Italy, spending their time sightseeing, reading, writing, meeting other travellers and intellectuals, and talking politics and philosophy until late in the night, never staying in one place for too long. Mary put up with Percy's interest in other women and flirted a little herself, but their carefree peregrinations were soon marked by tragedy. Their daughter Clara, barely a year old, died of dysentery in Venice, and less than a year later their son William, Wilmouse as they called him, died of malaria in Rome. We don't associate Italy with malaria now, but it was a major health problem in the 19th century, with 2 million cases and up to 20,000 deaths per year. Percy wrote prolifically during their time in Italy, publishing poems, essays and translations. But Mary fell into a deep depression after the loss of their children. Percy found it difficult to cope with her constant low spirits, writing in his journal, "My dearest Mary, wherefore hast thou gone, and left me in this dreary world alone?" His wherefore, meaning why, suggests to me that he was beginning to feel a little impatient with his wife's lingering grief. And how supportive he was we don't know, but just a few months after William's death, he adopted an 8-week-old baby girl, Elena. He was probably the father, but the mother is more of a mystery, possibly his sister-in-law Claire, or possibly a servant girl. But whatever joy Mary may have felt at having another child to look after, it was short-lived, as the baby died in the summer. Another death. They moved to Rome, where Mary sank deeper into her grief and struggled to feel any closeness towards Percy. She had thoughts of ending her life, and her only solace was writing, and she began work on her second novel, Matilda, another dark Gothic story about a young woman whose beauty provokes lustful desires in her father, who takes his own life to stop himself acting on his passion, while she spends the rest of her life full of despair about the unnatural love she inspired. Mary sent her father a copy of the manuscript so it could be printed in England, but Godwin felt the story was disgusting and detestable, and it was not published until 1959, 140 years later. Some believe that Godwin's reaction was because the novel may have been a little too close to home. The Shelleys had moved to Italy in the hope of improving Percy's fragile health. He was prone to frequent nervous attacks and may have had epilepsy. But their time there was filled with sorrow and loss, with the sole glimmer of joy for Mary being the birth of her fourth child, Percy Florence, born in the city after which he was named in November 1819, the only one of her children to survive to adulthood. Nowadays, we would think of the loss of a child as a devastating event in a person's life. But because child mortality was so high in the past, it is often assumed that people would have somehow been less affected. But I think that losing a child 200 years ago would have been just as devastating as it would be today, and that Mary's grief was entirely understandable. But somehow, through all of this, she managed to keep writing, producing the historical novel Valperga, and the verse dramas Proserpine and Midas, which she hoped would help pay her father's debts. In 1822, they moved to the isolated Villa Magni in the tiny seaside village of San Terenzo on the Italian Riviera. Mary didn't like it, regarding it as a dungeon, and her unhappiness was increased further when they received news that Claire's daughter Allegra had died of typhus. Yet another death of someone close. And Mary herself almost died when she hemorrhaged after a miscarriage. It was only Percy's quick thinking to put her into an ice bath that saved her life. It was a difficult summer. Mary was often ill or depressed, and Percy was haunted by visions of Allegra. He also had hallucinations of the friends they were sharing the villa with, Jane and Edward Williams, unpleasant visions of them as walking corpses, and him strangling Mary. Mary's grief was pushing Percy away, but instead of trying to comfort his wife, Percy turned his attention to Jane Williams, a more traditionally feminine woman, competent in all the housewifely skills, accomplishments that Mary did not have, and that Percy now seemed to idolise. She also had a lovely singing voice, and he bought her a guitar for musical soirees. Tensions mounted, and whilst Percy probably never acted on his feelings towards Jane, he dedicated impassioned poems to her, which he read aloud to the assembled company, undoubtedly causing his poor wife further pain and embarrassment. One of the reasons for their move to San Terenzo was to allow Percy to sail, and he had a boat built to his own specifications. He loved sailing, and at one point he wrote to a friend that there was no sympathy between him and Mary, and he would be content in his boat with Jane and her guitar. He also wrote asking for prussic acid or cyanide, probably the most lethal poison known at the time. We don't know if he was being entirely serious or who he had it in mind to use it on, but it does make you wonder. One day, Percy, Edward Williams and another friend decided to sail down to Livorno to meet Byron to discuss setting up a radical magazine. After a week of carousing, they set off on the return journey, but a terrible storm blew up. When a letter arrived at the Villa Magni asking if they had arrived home safely after the bad weather, there was panic. 10 days later, 3 badly decomposed bodies were washed up on the coast. Percy's body was identified by his clothes and the John Keats letters and poems found in his pockets. But because of quarantine rules, he could not be buried, so his remains were cremated on the beach. Mary was still too ill to attend, but his friend Edward Trelawney plucked Shelley's heart from the ashes, and this was eventually presented to his widow. There is no doubt that for the times, the Shelleys' marriage was unusual, and it was considered by many to be a scandal. And Percy was at times rather liberal with his affections. But despite their problems, Mary loved her husband and was still imagining a future together with him, dreaming of a life in
beautiful islands where earth, ocean and sky formed the paradise.
And she continued to honour him in death, keeping his heart in a drawer and never remarrying. His memory continued to inspire her work, as in her poem Absence.
Ah, he's gone, and I alone. How dark and dreary seems the time.
The Shelleys were never wealthy, but the death of her husband left Mary in an even more precarious financial position. She lived with the Hunt family and Byron in Genoa for a while, and Trelawney helped her raise the funds to enable her to return to England, leaving Percy behind in Rome. As she had no income, Mary and her son moved back in with her father and stepmother. She asked Percy's father, Sir Timothy Shelley, for financial support, but he said he would only agree if Mary gave up her son. Not surprisingly, she declined. Mary never actually met Sir Timothy, and they always communicated via lawyers. But they eventually came to an agreement that Sir Timothy would pay a modest allowance of £100 a year for their care, providing this was later repaid, and on condition that Mary did not publish a biography of Percy. This was an era when an income of £2,000 per year was considered, at least by Jane Austen in Sense and Sensibility, as necessary for setting up a respectable middle-class home. So £100 was not a lot. It was enough, however, to allow Mary to focus on editing Percy's poems, as well as her own work. She enjoyed being back in England with her family and reacquainted herself with her father's intellectual friends. But she found her limited means restricted her opportunities for socialising, and many people still regarded her relationship with Percy as scandalous, further narrowing the circles she could mix in. She received many marriage proposals, but always rejected them. One came from John Howard Payne, an American actor and poet, most famous for Home Sweet Home, a song that became popular during the American Civil War. Mary politely declined his proposal, saying that because she'd been married to a genius before, she could only marry another genius. Percy's first son by his wife Harriet died in 1826, making Percy Florence the new heir to the Shelley estate, and Sir Timothy grudgingly raised their allowance to £250 a year. The loss of their husbands allowed a close bond to develop between Mary and Jane Williams, and it has been speculated that they may have had romantic feelings for one another, as Mary seems to have admitted being intimate with women. Mary moved to Kentish Town in North London to be near Jane, and settled down to write her next novel, The Last Man, another science fiction story, but with more apocalyptic themes. It details one man's witnessing of human extinction and uses Percy as a model for the righteous and philosophical Republican character at the centre of the work. Following the death of Lord Byron from a fever while fighting in the Greek War of Independence, she helped his friend Thomas More compile his letters and journals for publication, which, despite heavy editing of the more colourful passages, still scandalised London. Wary of losing her income, however, she could not cooperate with Trelawney in his proposed biography of her late husband. In 1830, she published The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck, a historical romance set in the War of the Roses. Lodore, published in 1835, follows generations of the same family, exploring their conflicts, separations, reconciliations and financial worries, very much modelled on her own family. Faulkner, in 1837, was another Gothic story about the relationship between an orphan and a criminal. But none of her later works achieved the same popularity as Frankenstein, and none of them made her rich. She sold the copyright of the third edition for just £60 to the publisher Richard Bentley. In 1836, her father died at the age of 80, and as a dutiful daughter, Mary began organising his letters and a memoir for publication, as he had requested in his will. But after 2 years of work, she abandoned the project to concentrate on preparing a new edition of Shelley's collected works. It was Mary's involvement that led to his epic poem Queen Mab being published in full, with its controversial and openly atheist passages. Sir Timothy was still adamant that no biography of his son should ever be published, but Mary found a way around this by adding detailed notes about each poem that told his life story. She continued to follow her mother's feminist principles by providing assistance to women who were ostracised for their nonconformity, including Mary Diana Dodds, a single mother and cross-dressing lesbian, and Georgiana Paul, a woman thrown out by her husband for alleged adultery. Sir Timothy did agree to fund his grandson's education at Harrow School, and Mary moved to Harrow on the Hill so Percy Florence didn't have to board and she could save a little on the fees. The last book Mary published was Rambles in Germany and Italy, a detailed account of her travels with her son and his friends in the 1840s. Italy evoked some pleasant but many unpleasant memories for Mary, as it was there she lost her husband and 2 children, and she described the trip as a pilgrimage, which she hoped would cure her depression. She also wrote about the Young Italy movement and the desire for Italian unification and independence. Her mother had been criticised for dabbling in politics, but Mary received positive reviews of her book, especially the political sections, one reviewer describing her as a woman who thinks for herself on all subjects and who dares to say what she thinks. Her son, Percy Florence, went to Cambridge University and inherited the family estate when Sir Timothy finally died at the age of 90 in 1844. 4 years later, he married Jane Gibson, the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy banker, and Mary continued to travel with them both until she became too ill to do so. For years, Mary had been plagued by crippling headaches and pain on the right side of her body, which at times left her partially paralysed. Baffled by her symptoms, her doctors diagnosed her with neuralgia of the heart, and in 1847 she had surgery to try and relieve the pressure on the nerves on her spine. But this procedure left her weaker and in even more pain. She became increasingly immobile, her headaches were becoming ever more debilitating, and she had seizures and periods of being unable to speak. Put down to hysteria at the time, it's now thought that she probably had hemiplegic migraines, a rare type of migraine that causes temporary paralysis on one side of the body. But these were not described in medicine until 1910, and not widely recognised until the 1950s. In 1851, she died at the age of 53, surrounded by her family. Her cause of death was given as a brain tumour, but this is now thought unlikely. She had asked to be buried with her parents in St Pancras Old Church Cemetery, but as the area had become rather low rent, her son chose the more genteel surroundings of St Peter's Church in Bournemouth, to where her parents' remains were later moved. Placed with her in the family vault for all eternity was her husband's heart, wrested from the flames of his cremation on an Italian beach. Sir Percy Florence did not inherit his parents' literary talents, but he lived to the age of 70 and played a key role in memorialising them, publishing volumes of his parents' letters and documents. But he did not have any children, and the Shelley-Wollstonecraft line ended with his passing. The image of Frankenstein is so familiar to us, but as most depictions follow the 1931 Boris Karloff incarnation and have little to do with Mary Shelley's vision, it's easy to forget the tragic losses and depths of despair that led to Mary conceiving the idea of her monster. Her Frankenstein is a complex tale of life and death, love and revenge. Mary experienced loss throughout her life. Her mother, her brother, her daughter, and later her husband and 2 other children. These continual personal tragedies, her all-consuming grief, her guilt over her sister Clara's death, all combined in her mind and mingled with the new, almost mystical scientific advancements of galvanism to emerge as Frankenstein. The book can be interpreted in many ways. Mary as Victor Frankenstein, scared of the responsibility of creating life separate from his own and unable to care for his creation. And also Mary as the monster, abandoned at birth, bewildered by the world and just wanting acceptance. Recently, critics have begun to see Victor Frankenstein's disgust at the sight of his creation as a study of postpartum depression, as a representation of maternal rejection of a newborn infant, and to relate the entire novel to Mary Shelley's mixed feelings about motherhood. And there are other interpretations that focus on the modern Prometheus subtitle, that it is a warning about the dangers of science. Prometheus, you may remember, was a figure from Greek mythology, a titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, and who was condemned by Zeus for his defiance to eternal punishment by having his liver pecked out by an eagle. Of course, there are other interpretations as well, but these often say more about the interpreter than about Mary Shelley herself. And I think the extent of her achievements was anticipated by her father, who described her when she was still only 15 years of age as singularly bold, somewhat imperious, and active of mind. Her desire of knowledge is great, and her perseverance in everything she undertakes almost invincible. Although there has been more interest in her other work in recent years, and their feminist philosophical underpinnings, Mary Shelley's name will live on primarily through her greatest creation, Frankenstein, and everything that her book has inspired. I love all the old Frankenstein movies, and I re-watched the much-maligned Kenneth Branagh 1994 version when researching this video, and knowing something more about Mary Shelley's life and the inspiration for her book helped me appreciate it more. The 2017 movie with Elle Fanning also has its critics, but it sticks fairly close to the facts, and it does celebrate Mary's place in history in her own right, rather than as Percy Shelley's wife. And I am eagerly looking forward to Guillermo del Toro's new retelling. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one. As always, I'd love to hear your comments and any suggestions you may have for future topics. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.